Thank you. That's an admirable summary of those articles, by the way. Well, I do have a title, Solving the Gettysburg Address Mysteries, and the subtitle might be something like, however, A Fool Rushes In Where Angels Have Already Tread, because there are, of course, numerous books about the Gettysburg Address. Some have won major awards and prizes. You may be familiar with a couple of them. The one by Gary Wills, of course, the Pulitzer. And I've added my addition to this list here. It's coming out in September. But like many people, I was amazed and mystified by many of the mysteries of the address. It seemed odd to me that there were so many questions, and the introduction described some of those questions. We've all heard them before. Did he ride on a train? The order of the text? And some of those questions may seem quite trivial, but it seems to me that if we are going to understand the speech fully, we really have to know what he said. And it turns out that getting to the Gettysburg Address was a journey for Lincoln. It was an intellectual journey, it was a physical journey, and a journey that is inscribed in his manuscripts. But we can't know that journey unless we know the order of the texts of the Gettysburg Address. The major versions would be the delivery text of the speech. That's the speech that he held in his hands. Now, I'm going to tell you right off the bat, I think it's the Nicollet Copy. Yeah, that's the delivery text, the Gettysburg, the battlefield draft that he held while he's speaking. The spoken words, what did he actually say at Gettysburg? There's been a lot of discussion about that. All these questions are intermingled, and answering any one of these questions requires answering all of them, and so it takes a kind of comprehensive, so we're going to be looking at all three of these questions, unfortunately, so get ready. Lincoln's revision, too, the third one, after the speech, that has very important implications for the draft that he carried to Gettysburg and held on the stand, and also for the words that he spoke. So all three of these different stages of the speech are really one process, a journey to the new birth of freedom. And Lincoln was writing the Gettysburg Address at exactly the same time that he was writing and developing his Reconstruction policy for the annual message of 1863, the first time he announced the 10% plan, bringing seceded states back into the Union. And the same issues inform the Reconstruction policy and the annual message of 1863, December, and the Gettysburg Address. They are really twin documents. He spoke in the annual message of a new review, a new reckoning, and of course, at Gettysburg, the new birth of freedom. So understanding the order of the text of the manuscripts and the evolution of Lincoln's ideas as he wrote the manuscript, as he developed himself and discovered himself his own vision of these questions, because he was working it out as he was writing the speech. Understanding that evolution helps to understand and see more fully the issues of Reconstruction and Lincoln's vision of the Civil War, Lincoln's vision of the American experiment at this crucial point in the war. So some of these questions seem trivial, but they're actually getting at some of the key issues of the Civil War and, of course, of one of the texts that can sometimes be described as a sacred text of American civil religion. And I do have, too, the quote by David Mearns there. Mearns tried valiantly and published some very good work on the Gettysburg Address. There's a 150-odd page typescript in the National Library of Congress, I should say, of Mearns working out these issues, and I've learned a lot from his work, and so this is in some ways an homage to Mearns as well. Well, to get to that first question of the delivery text, I'm going to be running through this rather quickly. Much of my book covers this, and it's 6 of the 9 chapters, and it was hard to summarize. But I think the best way to get to the delivery text is to follow the words of James Speed, who was Lincoln's Attorney General in the first part of the Second Administration. And James Speed talked with Lincoln about the Gettysburg Address about a year after the speech. And Speed's words, I found, could be absolutely verified in many, many different ways. And he said that the day before he left Washington, Lincoln left Washington, he found time to write about half of a speech. Now, James Speed was not in Washington at the time of the speech. He was not in Gettysburg at the time of the speech. What he knows is what Lincoln told him. And notice he was very precise about the day before he left Washington. That's exactly what happened. Lincoln, of course, traveled to Gettysburg the day before, but it was the day before that that he had time to write the speech. So it was probably the night of November 17th that Lincoln finished the so-called, what I call the Washington draft, the draft of the speech as Lincoln took to Gettysburg. That Washington draft was probably written at this table, the famous Emancipation Proclamation table, the table in the cabinet room, which is today the Lincoln bedroom, which was recreated so beautifully in the Spielberg film, I think. And Lincoln probably wrote at that table the night, finished the final version of the Washington draft, the text that he took from Washington, on the night of November 17th, after meeting with the cemetery designer. And James Speed then, so the speech was, in my view, written rather late, probably in 3 or 4 days after deciding to go. He didn't decide to go until the last weekend before the address, and he didn't announce it to the press really until the 16th of November. So the speech was written late. It was not long written. So Speed then goes on and says what Lincoln told him. He took what he'd written to Gettysburg, and then he was put in an upper room in a house, and there's the house, of course, the famous Wills House in Gettysburg, many of us have visited. And he was put in an upper room and asked to be left alone for a time, and of course Lincoln was put in an upper room. His room was an upper room. There's no real way that Speed could have known this. As far as I could tell, it's not in any source that Speed had knowledge of in 1879. This is from Lincoln himself. Speed is telling us what Lincoln told him, and we're listening to Lincoln talk about writing the Gettysburg Address when we listen to James Speed tell what Lincoln said. He then prepared a speech, according to James Speed, but concluded it so shortly before it was to be delivered that he had not time to memorize it. Lincoln felt rushed by the end of the Gettysburg Address. He wanted to memorize it, and we can see that rush inscribed in the manuscript itself when he, on the morning of the speech itself, changed the version that he'd brought with him, changed the version as he'd revised the night before, and added in pencil new words and a last pencil page. I'm following John Nicollet in much of this, for those keeping track at home. Following John Nicollet in much of this. Nicollet I find to be a very good guide. He's gotten a lot of, I think, unfair press. This is the bedroom as it was recreated some decades ago before the recent renovation of the Wills house. And it shows the link that no doubt is the bed that Lincoln slept in the Wills house. This table here, the small table, that table is mentioned in one of the eyewitness recollections of that night. David Wills, his host, mentioned a small table that Lincoln was sitting at with paper before him, writing the Gettysburg Address. I don't know if that's the table, but it'd be nice to think that the Wills family had kept that table just as they'd kept the bed. Well, Lincoln in Gettysburg, of course, as we know, the night of Gettysburg, before giving the speech, he went next door to see the Secretary of State, William Seward, and Doug Wilson has suggested, which I think is absolutely true, that Lincoln was looking for help with the last part of his speech, and I think, in fact, it was the word Seward came through for him. Seward was very voluble. Seward came up with the word parish, I think, and suggests some information that's not conclusive, but I think Seward did help Lincoln with the last part of his speech, and probably parish from the earth is Seward's contribution. It's a favorite word with Seward, used it many dozens of times in speeches, not such a favorite word with Lincoln before this time. This then is the draft that he finished the morning of the speech and took with him to the stand at Gettysburg. The Nicollet Copy, the battlefield draft, it's often called the first draft, but these days that is highly contested. Gary Wills argues for a hypothetical, now lost text. So does Douglas Wilson, two-time winner of the Lincoln Prize, very eminent scholar, argues for a lost hypothetical delivery text copy. So these two authorities, also Governor Borat, who of course has written a great book on the Gettysburg Address, well known to us all, he argues for the Hay as the delivery text. And so even though in tradition the Nicollet Copy is often called the first draft, the battlefield draft you might say, arguing in favor of that these days is really rather different. We do have some eyewitness testimony to back up the circumstances of the writing, which some people don't follow such eyewitness testimony, but Ed McPherson was the representative in Congress of Gettysburg just before this speech had just been voted out. And he was friends with the host, David Wills, and he had I believe very clearly from David Wills this statement that it was written from an official letter sheet. Either that or it's Ed McPherson's own eyewitness testimony. I think there's reason to doubt that, but it certainly is from David Wills, the host in Gettysburg, who saw the manuscript, and he affirmed 4 times over, David Wills did, that he saw the manuscript in the house in Gettysburg, and it was a letter sheet according to Edward McPherson. And the other eyewitness testimony that I put some credence in is the testimony of Medicus, who was it's actually an anonymous newspaper article from 1882, This has long been known by Lincoln scholars and others, this statement, but it turns out that medicus is Daniel Slade, who is a medical doctor, a professor of zoology at Harvard, and who was in the Christian Commission in Baltimore and went to Gettysburg, I believe, as part of the choir. Medicus said he was part of the choir that sang before Lincoln sang, and it turns out Daniel Slade was in the Christian Commission in Baltimore. So I think Medicus and Daniel Slade published under the name Medicus, a popular story. So Medicus is Daniel Slade, and he saw German text, Executive Mansion on blank. So this is the battlefield draft, the Nicollet copy, according to my reading of this evidence. The first page, written in Washington on letterhead paper, the only page like that among Lincoln's 5 manuscripts. The second page, written wholly in pencil, the only page among the 5 copies written in wholly in pencil. So this is the letterhead page written in Washington. This is the pencil page. That was written in Gettysburg. And this journey that Lincoln made to the Gettysburg Address, to the speaker's stand when he spoke there in that iconic image, that journey is inscribed in this manuscript. But we can only see that when we recognize that this is the delivery text. Now, I recognize, however, that I've asserted many of those points, but the next 2 points along the way I think will help clarify some of those issues, because when we can figure out what the spoken words were, the best version of his spoken words, and then go on to illuminate what is the final revised version after the fact. These 2 next stages help to clarify the earlier stages. The history of the speech clarifies the mysteries of the manuscript. So what did Lincoln say at Gettysburg? Well, this is generally taken to be the best version of his words. It's the traditionally known, one of the best versions. It's the Associated Press version, as published in the New York Tribune, as you can see here, and it has the famous refinished, where is it? It's refinished work right there. A typographical error, clearly people recognize that. This is generally held to be the best version, the New York Associated Press version. But unfortunately, it turns out that telegraphic communication was very troublesome in the 19th century. And we can see how telegraphic communication works when we compare the text 2 different places along the routes. Now, there's Gettysburg, off sort of at a dead end of the telegraph and train routes. And there's the major train and, as far as I could tell, major telegraph routes as well in 1863, leading up north to Harrisburg, down to Baltimore, and across to Philadelphia. Now, as you cross, all bets are off once you cross the Appalachians. The text gets very odd in Pittsburgh and Chicago and beyond. And the Chicago Tribune text has often been held up as an independent text. It is merely a corrupted version of the same telegraphed version as you find in Pittsburgh. And you can see that here in this line, are created equal, good, good, and applause, according to the Pittsburgh version. Now, farther down the line, it becomes corrupted into created equal by a good God. So one has Abraham Lincoln invoking the highest authority, the other is the shouts of a crowd. And so when you have these differences in telegraphic communication, it becomes important to know what's the right telegraph version. And the New York Associated Press version is merely another version. You can trace down each of these lines, the changes in the speech as it reaches Boston, Hartford, Connecticut, Providence, Rhode Island, Baltimore, all the way down these different lines, the speech changes and evolves. Well, if it changes as you go down the lines, what happens when you roll the story backwards, back towards the original starting point in Gettysburg? You get closer to the text. And so the way I've constructed the original Associated Press version is not to use the AP New York version, but to use the AP version as originally, as I think, originally telegraphed from Gettysburg. That's where the speech came out of. That's where the first printed version of the Gettysburg Address came from. It was telegraphed out of Gettysburg. Now, you can't get back to Gettysburg itself. There's no daily paper. But you can get back to 3 different newspapers at different telegraphic distances, directions, I should say, from Gettysburg. Harrisburg, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. When you compare these 3 different versions and these 3 telegraphically different directions, you find remarkable uniformity among their texts. To find only 6 word differences among 800 telegraphed words of the Gettysburg Address is a remarkable thing. And 4 of those differences are very clearly, like refinished in the New York AP version, refinished is a clear typographical error. So 4 of those are just obvious typographical errors. It really just comes down to the or that government or governments in that last phrase. So these are exactly very much the same text, a 99, I did the calculation once, it's something like 99.27% exact. So when we collate those 3, we do come up with what I call the original AP version. Now, how do we know? I can hear you asking, how do we know that the text came out of Gettysburg and went north rather than coming out of New York and going south? Well, poor helps to decide that, and other issues as well. Poor power is in the delivery text, the Nicollet manuscript. Poor power is in the text south of New York City and even across the Appalachians for the most part. Poor disappears in New York City. It's not in the AP text in New York, and it disappears north of New York City. As the text is telegraphed beyond New York, that mutation, that genetic mutation essentially gets lost. And so telegraphic changes are just like genetic changes. They can be followed in the same way. And so we come into the original AP report. Now, the original AP report, just very rapidly, the original AP report is very similar to the New York AP report. There's a couple of differences, poor being one of them. There's 7 word differences. They're down at the bottom. And they really don't add up to much in terms of meaning, I don't think. I think it'd be very hard to find significant changes in meaning. So I'm not sure that we're looking at transformations in our understanding of Lincoln's speech. The AP is what I call the original text of the AP. It turns out that this text is the text as published by the Philadelphia North American. When I did the comparisons, the Philadelphia North American text came up to be the one among those 3 that was right. William Lambert, one of the big 5 Lincoln collectors in 1894, William Lambert identified the Philadelphia North American as the best text of Lincoln's speech, and it turns he doesn't say why, but it turns out I also agree. So this is actually the New York North American, Philadelphia North American text, which after putting in the blender comes out to be the same. Well, the original AP text also is very similar to the Hale 64. The Hale, published in 1864, that's the one by Charles Hale, the nephew of Edward Everett, who was a journalist at Gettysburg. Charles Hale said later, he wrote out in longhand the words Lincoln actually said. And the Hale version is often taken to be the text that Lincoln actually said. If you don't use the AP version, you use the Hale version, or you mix them up together and you say Lincoln said something in between the 2. Well, I think the Hale version is not as close to Lincoln's words. It shows clear Bostonisms. Hale lived in Boston. Months after the speech when he published it, now this is months later that he published his version, I think he had to go back and correct his writings. I think I don't think you can follow somebody's words for 275 words exactly in longhand, no matter how slowly Lincoln spoke. And he did speak slowly. So the Bostonisms are things like have given and poor. There's some other indications too. There's some oddities too in the Hale text that you wouldn't want to have in your perfect version of the spoken words. Very little note, for example. Nobody has that. Why then should one accept that text when the AP, the original AP, seems to be more standard? Well, this version of the Hale and the original AP then brings us to the best version of Lincoln's spoken words as printed. And it would be possible to create your own version of Lincoln's spoken words by comparing different texts. But I chose to go with the original AP report as I reconstructed it here, and then allow others to build from that if they want to tweak that with what they think Lincoln might have said, using the Hale text in some instances, using the delivery text in other instances. Those are matters of judgment. I'm not sure we're ever going to come to absolute certainty on any of those points. So the problem then is finding where can we be certain, and then we can develop some of the ideas about what might have happened from there. This, I think, is probably the best version we have of Lincoln's spoken words. Well, as the best version of Lincoln's spoken words, the AP text has garnered a lot of controversy and discussion. The AP was said for a long time, the AP was said to have been written on the basis of Lincoln's manuscript. I'm sorry about all the information here. But William Barton in the 1930s, a great writer, not such a great, I think, didn't put the story together perfectly, but he created really the current vision really of the AP speech address, which is that it was put together on the basis of Lincoln's words, but also the reporter, Gilbert, there he is, Gilbert. Gilbert said, well, I stopped taking notes because I was so entranced by the speech. Barton, the later writer, Barton then said, oh, that's when Lincoln gave Gilbert the speech. So the Associated Press version then would be a combination of the speech as spoken, taken down by Gilbert, and the manuscript itself. And that's caused untold trouble. And that's one of the reasons why, for example, Gary Wills and some others suggest there's a hypothetical text. There's reasons why that wouldn't work if you're going to use the Nicollet text. Well, if you go back to the original statement by Gilbert, and the original statement by Gilbert has not been known in the literature, mentioned a couple of places, but if you go back to the original statement by Gilbert, Gilbert does say, yes, I stopped taking notes, but then he does not say Lincoln gave me the manuscript. He goes on to talk about other aspects of the story and to tell the history of the speech. This is, again, 1917. He or his daughter go on to tell the history of the speech, relying upon the words of John Russell Young. There are many quotations not quotations, there are many words from the Gilbert account, which are word for word taken from the John Russell Young story. So Gilbert is essentially paraphrasing John Russell Young in many parts of his account of how he wrote the Associated Press version of the speech. And so when we compare Gilbert and Young, I'm going to read the Gilbert version over here, and I put numbers in there for points of comparison. You follow along the John Russell Young version and see the comparison. So Joseph Gilbert said, before the dedication ceremonies closed, the president's manuscript, so there's manuscript up there, manuscript was copied with his permission, and as the press 2 report, there two, was made from the copy, no 3 transcription from shorthand 4 notes was 5 necessary. This is just one among many instances in Gilbert's account that paraphrase, sometimes very often word for word, and the structure too of the Young account. To me, that means that Joseph Gilbert, as he never claimed to have actually had Lincoln's manuscript. He didn't say that he had Lincoln's manuscript. It was, in that suspicious passive voice, it was copied. John Russell Young also, I think, is just giving a general account of how he thinks it might have gone when he said the manuscript had been given to the Associated Press. I don't think that's an eyewitness account either by John Russell Young. There was a New York Times reporter who also reported just before John Russell Young that it was commonly believed that the manuscript had been given to the press, but nobody had any real information about that. Nobody ever stepped forward to say, I was the reporter that took down Lincoln's words from his manuscript. And they had plenty of opportunities to do so across these decades when the Gettysburg manuscript was becoming so important. So I think the conclusion is that Young had no direct knowledge of how the AP report was created either. He had asked John Hay about the manuscript. He never said anything there about, well, I know that it was given to a reporter or something of that sort. So I think what we have then is the AP report is the words as spoken, not the words copied from a Lincoln manuscript. And that's the reconstructed original AP report I've highlighted in green. I hope it comes out highlighted in green. Some of the key changes. This here is just moved. That the government, the AP, and the New York AP had that, and that governments. To detract, that was a toughie to keep in there, but because it's not in most speeches, but it's in all 3 of the underlying texts of the Associated Press version that I use. So to detract is also on there. Well, that then gives us the spoken words. The next step is the final revision. We have the delivery text, the spoken words, the final revision, the Bliss copy, of course, the one that is inscribed in stone on the Lincoln Memorial, the one that is inscribed on this monument here. Where is that? Where is that monument? That's Gettysburg. That's the first time that Lincoln's words are inscribed in stone, the monument of the first Minnesota, commissioned and erected in 1866, 1867. It also has words from Everett's speech on there. It's a beautiful memorial, and it's the first time that Lincoln's words are inscribed in stone. Why did Lincoln undertake this post-speech revision? It's not because he wanted to print it for Edward Everett. That's the story that is very commonly told, that Lincoln revised the speech so that it could be published in the official publication of the day's events. That would be the printed version, the little brown version, the printed version of the speech published by David Wills and Edward Everett. But David Wills said, I did not publish my version from Lincoln's speech. And this is a piece of information that Gary Wills did not recognize, didn't give credence to, and I think that led him down some difficult paths. He was aware of it, but he argued against it. If you take a look at Lincoln at Gettysburg, he has an argument against it. But it was not to do that printed version. It was instead, why did he revise the speech? Well, where did this, if this did not come from a Lincoln manuscript, where did this come from? And this does turn out to be a key question in the story of the texts. The little brown version came from a handwritten copy, it is true, a handwritten copy not by Lincoln, but by David Wills. David Wills looked at the newspaper version, copied out, and he copied out what I believe he copied out the New York Tribune version. He copied that out and he sent it to Everett. And Everett then had it published in that printed version that you just saw a moment ago. So the text I'm showing you now, the handwritten text I'm showing you now, was the copy text for this printed version. It was not a Lincoln text, it was a text by David Wills. It was copied from the New York Tribune. And if you look at the title up here, for example, there are many indications. I believe it's Wills's handwriting, but of course I'm not a handwriting expert. The title up here is the same title once it's corrected. It had a different title, then he corrected it, and that corrected title is the title it was published under. There's also a page number here, which corresponds to the pages of the manuscript that Everett had published as the printed version. This then leads us to suggesting then that the printed version came from, not from a text by Lincoln. Lincoln did not have anything to do with that printed version. It was printed on the version by David Wills. That version that I just showed you is in the Everett Papers in Massachusetts. We can see that story unfolding when Everett sends Lincoln this printed version on January 30th and says, here's the printed version. Oh, by the way, this is a separate request. Oh, by the way, please send me a handwritten copy. I want to sell it for charity. A few days later, Lincoln replies and says, thank you so much for sending the printed version. Here's the manuscript that you asked for. That manuscript that he asked for, that manuscript that has Everett's name, is, of course, the Everett Text. And there it is there. That's the text that the school children of Illinois bought with their pennies. That's the one in Springfield, Illinois today. The Everett Text was written within a couple of days of receiving this document. So the question then becomes, what's the copy text of the Everett? Where did Lincoln get the words of the Everett Text? And he got it from this printed version through the Hay copy. The Hay copy goes between these two documents. The Hay copy was Lincoln's first sort of working with his manuscript, working with his delivery text to figure out what he's going to write for Everett. He then recopied the Hay document as the Everett. And here's how John Nicollet described that. Here's how John Nicollet described that process. It's exactly what Lincoln did. This is 30 years after the event. John Nicollet was involved with this process. He was in the correspondence. His fingerprints are all over this documentation. And John Nicollet said, yes, Lincoln looked at different versions of the Associated Press report. He looked at his delivery text, and then he created a new revised copy. That new revised copy in its finished form is the Everett. But Nicollet also said the manuscript notes of the revision. When he's talking about the Hay text, he said these are the manuscript notes of the revision. It's an intermediate text, the Hay is, between the printed version and the finished Everett text. And that solves many of the problems, the mysteries of the manuscript, putting the order in this fashion. It has never been suggested, this exact order has never been suggested. Now, you want more proof, I hear you. I want more proof. Well, there are three common traits between the printed version and the Hay text as originally written, without any of the edits. The Hay text as originally written, the the original Hay text. These three are a fingerprint. The printed version is essentially a New York AP text, slightly amended. So finding three differences between the printed version, the little brown printed version, finding three unique correspondences of that and the Urhe, Lincoln's manuscript, that's a fingerprint. And the syllogism, I'm going to go through those in just a moment, but the syllogism is this. The Little Brown text is unrelated to Lincoln. He did not create the document that created the Little Brown printed version. And we know when the Little Brown version was created. It was created after the fact. The Hay document was written on the basis of the Little Brown printed version. That means the Hay has to be post-speech, and in addition to the other information about what the delivery text is. And then that means that we have then solved the problem of the Hay manuscript. And when you solve the Hay manuscript, this is what David Mearns recognized, the Hay was the center of the mysteries. When you solve that problem, the other problems fall into place. Well, the first textual similarity, I'm going to run through, unfortunately, very briefly. Paragraphing. It might not seem like much, but the first appearance of the paragraphing of the final version that you and I know that's inscribed in the walls of the Lincoln Memorial and elsewhere, the first appearance of that paragraphing is in this published version, printed version. It's not in Lincoln's delivery text. It's a different paragraphing. Lincoln copied this speech, copied this version into the Urhe, the original, and used the same paragraphing. He had two opportunities to change that. There are many different forms of paragraphing in the other AP reports. He did keep the first paragraphing of his delivery text here. He kept that one here. But he changed the delivery manuscript in the second paragraphing. So he had two opportunities at least to change that. So this is an important one, I think. It gives a whole sense of feel to the manuscript. Also, a capital L. And these are different versions down the line. In most of the AP versions, you have no capitalization. The New York AP has capital L, capital N. That's rather unusual. When David Wills, using the New York Tribune text, copied it, he regularized much of the capitalization, and there are other instances where he regularized it. This is, I think, a conscious decision. David Wills kept the capital L in Liberty in that handwritten version. The capital L in Liberty then gets translated into the Little Brown version. There it is right there. That's where Lincoln found it when he was copying the Urhe, and that's where it stays to the end of the line. When we look at Lincoln's final version of the Gettysburg Address, that capital L in Conceived in Liberty, that first wonderful, magnificent sentence of the Gettysburg Address, that L is in some ways, the capital L is the gift of David Wills. He had a hand in this. He was the main person behind the cemetery, he was the main person behind the ceremony, and he also had a hand in the speech. It's a wonderful and fitting tribute in some ways of David Wills. And when we see the Gettysburg Address as Lincoln wrote it, that is David Wills' gift to his country. The last of the three is a word, finally a word. We had paragraphing, we have a capital, now we've got a word. Everybody has that cause, that cause, that cause, that cause, for which they hear gave. David Wills, for some reason, changed the. It might be a mistake. I think this is probably a mistake. David Wills wrote the. Lincoln, it was then published as the in the Little Brown. Lincoln found the in the Little Brown. He first wrote it in the Urhe, and then he also made a mistake. He wrote, sign that he's copying. And then later, when he when he was revising and changing the Urhe and making the Hay document that we know that's on display, of course, within the Hay document is the Urhe, he changed it to that cause, probably reverting to his delivery text, that cause for which they here gave. So we have three fingerprints of the printed Little Brown version and the Urhe. These and the other information, I think, are, to my mind, definitive that the Hay was written after the fact on the basis of the Little Brown speech. And that gives us this order of texts. We have, first, Lincoln writes and delivers the speech. He wrote it in Washington. The letterhead page, everybody unanimously agrees. The letterhead page is the earliest extant page we have. It was written in Washington before going to Gettysburg. He then revised it in Gettysburg. There's no doubt that Lincoln revised in Gettysburg, changing the bottom of the lower corner here, changing the words to stand here to we here be dedicated, ungrammatical and uncorrected. And the fact that it's ungrammatical is not remarkable. It's uncorrected. When Lincoln was going over his speech before giving it, when he didn't have time to memorize his speech, he was looking at his text, he underlined a word. What they did here, it doesn't show up here very well, what they did here, did is underlined. And he also did not correct that ungrammatical error. I think this shows, it's just as John Nicollet said, it was the morning of the speech that Lincoln undertook essentially a crash revision of the Gettysburg Address, with expressing new vision, a new idea of what his speech should be. And the first time we know of the words "A New Birth of Freedom" written by Lincoln are in that pencil page written on the morning of the speech in Gettysburg. It's this middle phase of the speech that gave people problem, when the text was telegraphed up to New York, and then David Wills wrote it out by hand and then sent it off to Everett in Boston to be printed in the little brown version. That's this itinerary here. Printed version, Wills text, little brown version. And then Lincoln wrote the Hay, and there's the first page of the Hay on the basis of this document. This is the middle section that that caused so much trouble. But I think once we look at the evidence, it solves many, the great majority of the mysteries, and they no longer be the textual problems. They don't become mysteries so much as wonders to be explained. We can now dig into the text and see what Lincoln really meant and said. We have to have confidence in our knowledge of Lincoln's words before we can hear what he said. And we haven't had that confidence in the Gettysburg Address. There's never been a time in the past 150 years that people could say there's consensus on which text is first. There's not going to be consensus on this anytime soon, but this is my argument for the way those texts ought to work out. And I thank you very much. I'm told that we do have some time for questions, so if you have questions about the Gettysburg Address particularly, I'd be happy to take. Thank you.
Hi, Fred Martin. I am a director of the Institute here, and I was an AP reporter, and I covered a number of speeches and dictated a number of stories, and I have some questions as to how the reporter interacted with the telegraph operator. Because I think that, and then whether or not in the more modern AP, I mean, the New York Bureau edits and revises everything or clarifies it. And my question is, first of all, in a small bureau, you go in and you type on a teletype, and the story goes out to the desk of the bureau, and sometimes you have a text. Sometimes you don't. In this case, it appears the reporters did not have a text. And so therefore, this reporter was writing out in pencil, and probably, I presume he didn't dictate to the telegraph operator. He probably handed his scribbling. And the question is, could the telegraph telegraph operator read the scribbling as it was written, or could he have made mistakes, or could he have made changes? And did you look into this aspect, sort of
yes,
technical?
There is a very large and very interesting literature on the telegraph at this time. It was a new technology. There were romance novels about telegraph relationships, just like today with the internet relations. I was not, to my own confidence, able to determine exactly, many of these questions exactly, at this exact moment in those exact telegraph stations. We know what generally occurred, but that's a far cry from saying what happened in this exact instance. The reporter probably took it down again in shorthand. I think I know who took that shorthand report. Excuse me, can somebody help that gentleman? Okay. We have a slip and fall here. Well, the reporter probably handed a piece of paper to the telegraph operator, who then had to translate it into Morse code, and then that Morse code was sent down the lines. The weather could affect the transmission. Whether there are birds on the line could affect transmission. There were many, and then it had to be translated again from the dots and dashes into script. Now, they had machines that could translate on either side of that equation. It's unclear whether they were using machines or whether human beings were involved in that. Probably they were using machines in some of the larger places. However, it is clear that common practice of the day was that when a report came out of Washington, D.C. and went north to the AP offices in New York, papers along the way would pick up that report. They would not wait for it to go to New York and then come back to them. They wanted to be first on that, and so they published things that went up the line. So that's why the speech in Philadelphia differs from that of New York. It wasn't telegraphed up to New York and then back down to Philadelphia. It came up from the South. Thank you.
Apologize for my ankle giving way on there. It's, I guess,
We're
sitting here
glad. We're just glad you're okay.
There are other speeches where Lincoln took the opportunity to revise the Cooper Union. He goes to the newspaper office, the farewell address. He's on the train dictating what he wants the version to be. The final version that you have, is there anything we learn about Lincoln's thinking from the difference between his original thinking and how he wrote it in the final one that's on the monument?
Is it possible to get the slide back up? I guess not. Oh, there. Oh, sorry. Yes, we do learn something very important. We learn that this was a journey, and that when Lincoln started out in Washington, D.C., he was writing on the basis of the July 7th speech that he gave after Gettysburg, when he first made the connection between the Declaration of Independence and the victory at Gettysburg. That's why he talked about all men created equal in the July 7th speech. The first time during his presidency, he spoke those words in public. At Gettysburg, he picked up on that same theme of connecting Gettysburg to July 4th and to all men are created equal. But it's November. There's no real reason to do that, except Lincoln had already done that in July. So all men are created equal comes from the July speech. It comes from Lincoln's meditation on the meaning of the Declaration, obviously. The letterhead page talks about the founders. It talks about issues revolving around the issues of 1863, the special message to Congress in 1861, the debates with Douglas are in that letterhead page. These are the questions of legality, constitutionalism, the principles of the American Republic, which really go back to the beginning and middle years of the war. The pencil page, the page written in Gettysburg, that is the page that reflects the new reckoning, the new birth of freedom, the new review that he was undertaking. When, as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation and the policies we talked about here, Lincoln was coming to a new understanding of the war. And he came to recognize that the United States was going to be a society in which black and white coexisted in equality. He, of course, had flirted, he had supported colonization, but he'd lost that emphasis by about 63, 64. And so in this new society, in the new reckoning, in the new birth of freedom, black and white are going to live together, and that was going to occur on the principle of civic and political equality. It's at this time that he declares that troops will be paid equally, for example. It's at this time exactly that he's talking about suffrage for blacks in Louisiana and begins to push behind the scenes and then publicly for suffrage. The new birth of freedom is a keynote of the second part of Lincoln's tenure as president, and that's what we learn. And it's at Gettysburg that he came to that poetic realization that the new birth of freedom was necessary after visiting the battlefield, after sitting there in the stand with Edward Everett when he spoke those words.
Can I ask you about a related question about the Gettysburg Address concerning where it was delivered? I was told by a very knowledgeable tour guide that there's a question about the spot where it was delivered, and I guess spot is interesting considering it's Lincoln, and that about the only thing that we're sure of is that it was not delivered where the monument now is. Can you give us any light about that?
I do. I have a slide that gives us light on this. This is the magnificent panorama of the etching by Joseph Becker for Frank Leslie's Illustrated in December of '63. Every detail, as far as I can tell, every detail is real and accurate, except for one. Can you pick out the one detail that is clearly not right? The tree is in leaf. In November, there were no... But there are photographs of that scene from this area with that tree and leaf, photographs from July that Becker was working from. So Becker was working from photographs. He was also, I think, there. I haven't been able to put that together exactly, but Becker, I think, was there, or he had very good eyewitness testimony to put those photographs together in the proper way. This shows the exact scene with people selling lemonade and souvenirs on the stands on Baltimore Avenue, the entrance to the town cemetery here. The parade itself came up behind, up Tawnytown Road, and you can see here they're entering into the open area, which was cordoned off by the troops with their bayonets. You could see those in the pictures on the Library of Congress webpage. Beautiful, wonderful illustrations. Take a look at them. And they filled up in this open area. This is the moment when the speakers came up to the stand and sat down and shook hands and got ready for the ceremony to begin. Here are the graves over to the side with their they were like garden beds, raised garden beds, some people said at the time, because they were still so fresh, with only boards indicating the names of the soldiers. The marble is added later, the arc of marble was added later. So this shows, as far as William Frassanito, I think, has done the best work on this personally, where he takes all the photographs. If you don't know Frassanito's work, definitely buy every book you can by William Frassanito. And he takes all the photographs and puts it together and says, and they verify this general depiction. It was in, the stand itself was in what is today what was then too, the town cemetery, an unused part of the town cemetery. And probably this flagpole was very close to where the monument is today, if not exactly where the monument is today. There might be a little bit of question about that, but clearly and they were facing this direction. The speakers faced this direction here, which is more or less to the north, away from, they weren't facing into the National Cemetery as we know it today. They're facing away sort of this way. So most people were in this region here between the flagpole and in this region here, and that's what you see on the photographs that were taken there. We have a 360-degree view of this event from photographs and etchings. It's one of the most well-documented events at that time period in the Civil War. Did that answer the question? I guess you sat down. Okay.
Hi. Just to clarify, the Hay and the Hay version, are those two separate texts?
No, I'm sorry, yes. They are the same text. And in that beautiful facsimile edition done by Levenger and Doug Wilson and Mr. Selleck, this is the Hay version facsimile. Now, it wasn't creased in the middle, but the Hay version is one document, it's one page. It's just that what I'm calling the Hay is the original text before it was edited. There are 9 edits on this document. If you ignore those 9 edits, that's the undertext.
Got it.
The text underneath this document here that we call the Hay. So we have to recognize the delivery text has 3 or 4 texts built into it, within it. And that's where the texts inscribe the history of the speech. And the story of Lincoln's developing ideas is written in those manuscripts.
Got it.
It's a
Thank
remarkable
you.
story.
Martin, you want to talk about what professors are?
I'm sorry, yes.
Just real quick.
Certainly.
Thanks for your great delivery. But the fact that you have
I'll repeat the question.
You have battlefield and battle dash field and some of those, I know that's no significance, but the tree could be coniferous or almost a new wood.
It's a poplar. Does that help? It's a poplar. It is. Thank you. Yes. No. There's no detail that is unimportant in this story because we're dealing with such an important text, and so it does seem trivial sometimes. But when you put the trivia together, you create, and you could see a vision of this text emerge that's really quite remarkable. All right. Well, thank you so much. Well done, my friend. Thank you.
We'll now take a lunch break, and thanks once again to the National Archives Foundation for providing for that. We'll reassemble for our next speaker at 1 o'clock. You've got 1 hour.